Today is complex numbers and how to work with complex numbers. The first thing you need to know is kind of where a complex number comes from. Complex numbers are just imaginary numbers, and they come from taking the square root of -1. Usually when they take the square root of -1, it won't work, but actually that is an imaginary number. So the square root of any number, of a negative number, is I. On the coordinate plane, when we're talking about quadratics, usually the solutions are when you cross the x-axis, but when a quadratic or a parabola does not cross the x-axis, then it has imaginary solutions. So when something does not cross the x-axis, it has two imaginary solutions. Now, some things you need to know about imaginary numbers is that imaginary numbers, you're not allowed to use exponents. You'll get exponents, but you can't leave your final answer in exponents. So this is the pattern. It's going to be for I squared, I to the third, I to the fourth, and then it would continue up. This would be I to the fifth, I to the sixth, I to the seventh, I to the eighth, and so forth. Okay, so this is what it is. I won. I won, woohoo! And so the two middle ones are negatives. So I is just I squared is equal to -1, I to the third is equal to -I, and I to the fourth is equal to 1. Okay? So if you're given a problem that says something like I to the 8th, you can't have any exponents, so you have to count. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I to the 8th is actually equal to 1. If I have I to the 11th, we just count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I to the 8th is the same as I to the third, so it's -I. The one that you're going to see the most, and the one you should probably memorize and go ahead and remember, is that one. The I squared is -1. Okay? All right, so there's several different things you have to be able to do with imaginary numbers. The main thing you need to know is that you just need to treat them like variables. The only time it's different is when there's exponents, and when there's exponents, you need to plug in one of these four things based on what it is. Okay, so the first type of problem we have is to simplify. Well, I know the square root of 25 is 5, but because I have a negative here, it becomes plus or minus 5, and whenever I take a negative out, it becomes I. So the square root of -25 is plus or minus 5I. For the square root of -32, the first thing you have to do is you got to kind of break down 32 so you know what it is. 32 is 2 and 16, which is 2 and 8, which is 2 and 4, which is 2 and 2. So I broke it down, and now I need to take out my pair. So I have one pair of 2's and two pair of 2's. So when I have two pair of 2's, that means two 2's can go out front. Well, 2 times 2 is 4. And so I have plus or minus 4, but remember I have that negative there, so it becomes plus or minus 4I, and then I look to see if there's anything left. Is there anything that didn't have a partner? And this one, too, didn't have a partner. So my answer is plus or minus 4I square root of 2. Okay, go ahead and try this third one here by breaking down the square root of 50. Once you think you got it, go ahead and hit pause or play so that you could check your work. Okay, so you don't break down the -4, you just break down the 50, which is 25 and 2, which is 5 and 5. So I have a pair of 5, so I can bring this 5 out front. -4 times 5 is -20, but I had a negative, and whenever you take the square root of a negative, it becomes I square root of 2, because I had a leftover 2. Usually we've been writing plus or minus, but because this has a negative sign, we're just going to keep it as a negative. All right, the next thing you have to be able to do is you have to be able to do operations on imaginary numbers. Well, remember what I said is imaginary numbers are just like variables, so we're going to combine our like terms. 2 plus 4, well, that's just 6. 3I and a negative 5i, that is a negative 2i. And that's the answer. For the second one, I have to distribute. I have to distribute the 4i to each of these, the negative 4i. So negative 4i times 2 is negative 8i. Negative 4i times positive 5i is negative 20i squared. Well, I have an issue because of this I squared. You cannot have exponents for i's. And so I squared, if I look up here, I squared is the same as negative 1. So what I'm going to do is instead of I squared, I'm going to plug in a negative 1. Negative 20 times negative 1 is a positive 20. So numbers usually come first, so it'll be 20 minus 8i. And that's it. Okay, for this last one over here, what you need to do is you need to go ahead and try and FOIL or double distribute that out. Distribute the 5 to everything and distribute the 2i to everything and see what you get. When you think you have your answer, go ahead and press play so you can check what you got. So 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 4 is 20i. Now I go my next number. Negative 2 times 3 is negative 6i. Negative 2 times positive 4 is negative 8i squared. I get that squared. So I bring down my 15. 20 minus 6 is a positive 14i. And here's the issue. I can't have an I squared, so I plug in that negative 1. So this right here, negative 8 times negative 1 becomes a positive 8. So now I have a positive 8 and a positive 15 I can combine. 15 plus 8 is 23 plus 14i. Okay, so the next type of problems we're going to do is we're going to have to solve for x and y when we have an I in the equation also. Now this looks awkward, but it's actually not that bad. So go ahead and write the problems down, and then you can see what we're going to do. Okay, so for number 1, my 4x is the first number, and it's in the same place as 8. So that's what it equals. 4x equals 8, so x is 2. There's your first answer. For my second part, the i's are always come second, so 2i is the same as y times I. So there's my second equation. Well, if I have a y on both sides, they're gone, so y is just 2. So these problems aren't really difficult, it's just knowing what to do with them. And remember, numbers go with numbers, so that's the 4x and the 8, and then the i's go with i's, which is 2i and yi. Okay. So why don't you pause the video so you could try number 2 and then come back when you think you have it. Okay, so you should have set these up where the x's go with the number and the i's go with the i's. So negative 10x equals 20, so x is negative 2. And then here, if I cross off my y's, to get rid of that 3, I'm going to divide, so y is 4. Okay, so the next type of problem we have is we're going to be solving problems where we can take the square root. You've done these before in section 3.1, but it's been a little while. And these will actually have some negative square roots, which that tells us that we'll have an I. So I solved this problem by just getting rid of the 10, so I minus 10 on both sides. So I get x squared is negative 4. And to get rid of that square, I take the square root. Well, remember, you can't really take the square root of a negative. And when you do take the square root of a negative, it becomes an I. And so the square root of 4 is 2. So the answer is plus or minus 2I. Okay. All right, for number 4, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to get rid of that 1 and then get rid of that 4. Okay, so go ahead and try that and then hit pause or hit play so that you could check your work. So you should have gotten x squared over 4 equals negative 10. To get rid of a divide by 4, you multiply by 4. Don't get freaked out by fractions, just think that fractions are a divide. And so now I have x squared is equal to negative 40. And so I take the square root of this. And so I get plus or minus. Well, I have to break down 40. 40 is 2 and 20, 2 and 10, 2 and 5. I have 1 pairs of 2's, so that means I can take 1 2 outside. But I also have this negative, so that means I take out a 2i. What's left over is my 2 and 5, and 2 times 5 is just 10. So my answer is plus or minus 2i squared root of 10. Okay, so the last thing we're doing is very similar to 3 and 4. We're finding the zeros, okay? So if I have this function, I'm trying to find out when this function crosses the x-axis, so that's when it's 0. So instead of f of x, I write 0 equals 3x squared plus 6. Well, now I just have to solve this for x. So I have minus 6 on both sides. So negative 6 equals 3x squared. I divide by 3 on both sides. So x squared equals negative 2. And now I take the square root. Well, remember when you take the square root, there's a couple things you got to remember. First of all, it's plus or minus. And the second thing is I took the square root of a negative. And when you take the square root of a negative, it becomes, yeah, that's right, it becomes I. So I square root of 2. And that's the answer. So whenever you're solving problems like this, you got to get x by itself. And if you have something where it says find the zeros of the function, a 0 is just a 0. It's where it crosses the axis. So go ahead and instead of f of x, plug in 0, do your inverse operations, and solve for the variable.